Felipe wasn't just handsome. He was the kind of man who made time slow down the moment he entered any room. Possessing a serene, almost ethereal beauty, his face seemed sculpted. Grayish-blue eyes like the sky before a storm, slightly wavy black hair always neatly combed back, revealing a high and noble forehead. A defined jawline, discreet lips, and a strong body shaped by years of quiet, dedicated weight training. But what drew the most attention wasn't his body, his face, or his billionaire status. It was the silence. A silence that wrapped around him like a force field. He spoke little, avoided physical contact, didn't know how to take compliments, and always walked with tense shoulders, as if the world hurt him without even touching him. At 34, Felipe ran a tech empire worth billions. His apps dominated the artificial intelligence market. He was considered one of the most influential young minds in business, featured on magazine covers, in major articles and academic studies. But the same mind capable of designing systems that predicted human behavior with surgical precision couldn't make sense of sudden hugs, hysterical laughter, or sarcasm disguised as praise. Diagnosis: mild autism, a subtle yet relentless spectrum. And no matter how much the world said Felipe had it all, money, beauty, power, he carried an absence that tore him apart silently every night. He had never fallen in love with someone real, and every time he tried, he was left hurt, exposed, or even lonelier than before. Felipe grew up surrounded by expectations. The son of entrepreneurs, he was raised in silence, in boarding schools, with strict schedules and little room for emotional error. From a young age, he perceived the world differently. The textures of clothing bothered him. Loud noises made him tremble. People's facial expressions looked like encrypted codes. As a teenager, he tried to fit in. He went out with a few girls, all beautiful, all charmed by his introspective manner, by his mystery. But the dates always ended in silence, frustration, and guilt. He couldn't sustain the game of seduction, didn't know when to laugh, when to touch, when to give in, so he stopped trying. Adulthood only deepened the barrier. Felipe became a legend in the tabloids backstage. Some said he was asexual, others swore he was gay and hiding it. A few made up stories about deep trauma, and the more people speculated, the more he withdrew. His house, a modern mansion on the outskirts of Campos do Jordão, was protected by high walls, silent surveillance, and a routine that never changed. He worked from home, read at home, ate at home, only went out when absolutely necessary, never posted photos, never smiled in the few interviews he accepted, and solitude. That was the only constant presence in his life. But what few knew, and even fewer understood, was that Felipe loved deeply. He just didn't know how to express that love in the way the world expected. When an assistant broke down crying in front of him, he didn't hug her. He just left a chocolate on her desk. When an employee shared a family issue, he didn't answer with words. He simply raised their salary the next month without a word. Felipe was made of quiet, intense gestures. And still, he found no reciprocity, because the women who came close to him didn't see his essence. They saw a trophy, a millionaire, beautiful, famous man, and in their minds, available. But Felipe wasn't. He never had been, because inside him was a locked castle with many doors, and none of the keys he knew ever worked. Until that moment, Felipe's name ran wild across gossip apps and society columns. Not a week went by without some headline linking him to a famous woman. But all the speculation stemmed from assumptions, or from frustrated attempts by women who approached, flirted, and collided with an invisible wall. They were stunning. Some, international models. Others, rising actresses, digital influencers with millions of followers, TV hosts with rehearsed smiles and perfectly sculpted curves. But none of them could pierce the limits of Felipe's icy gaze. A gaze that, while beautiful and deep, was impenetrable. At the last company party, Marcela, the confident, striking blonde marketing director, made her third attempt to get close. She laughed at jokes he didn't understand, casually touched his shoulder, trying to spark a dance. He stepped back politely. Later, he apologized for not knowing the right moment to react. She ended the night calling him arrogant, cold, stuck up, said he was too weird for someone that handsome. But Felipe wasn't shaken. He simply logged it as one more failed attempt at connection. Another woman who confused appearance with reciprocity. On another occasion, Mirella, a Brazilian model gaining international fame, showed up at Felipe's mansion uninvited. She arrived with a lavish bouquet of blue orchids and a 10,000 real bottle of wine. Claimed she just wanted to meet the genius who inspired her creativity. Felipe received her politely, as etiquette required. Served coffee. Asked a couple of questions about her career. But when she crossed her legs, leaned toward his chair, and whispered something about living an unforgettable moment, he stood up, thanked her calmly, and said with the composure of a monk, "I can't give you what you're looking for. It wouldn't be fair of me." Mirella left confused, and later told the press he was a robot. Felipe didn't feel contempt for women. Quite the opposite. He admired them. He watched in fascination. Their chosen hairstyles, their vocal tones, their perfume choices. But he could never truly connect. Conversations felt like strategy games with rules he didn't understand. Questions came loaded with hidden motives. Compliments felt like traps. And touch, that sudden brush on the arm, the shoulder, the fingers, sent chills not of pleasure, but of discomfort. Sensory confusion. Felipe's body rejected non-verbalized contact, and his mind recoiled from the emotional expectations that always accompanied romantic encounters. Despite all the social progress, one cruel stigma remained. A man who is handsome, rich, and famous must be a womanizer, must enjoy partying, must be living the high life. But Felipe was the screaming exception, and he paid dearly for it. He was constantly mocked between the lines of gossip columns. They said he was a virgin, that no one satisfied him, that he preferred solitude out of fear of failure, and each headline hit his already fragile identity like a hammer. Hallways at his company whispered about him. Female employees dressed up more when he walked by. They placed bets on who would make him give in, but no one could touch him. Not with words, not with gestures, and deep down, that sparked resentment, because the world does not accept what it cannot conquer. And then came Melissa. Unlike all the rest, Melissa was quiet, a librarian at the company's headquarters. She had a delicate face, wore glasses, and dressed in soft, loose clothing. She never tried anything with Felipe, never looked at him more than necessary, but by a twist of fate, they ended up sharing an elevator. She dropped a book. He bent down to pick it up. As he handed it back, she simply said, "You have beautiful hands." Felipe, surprised, murmured a "thank you" with his eyes down. She didn't smile, didn't insist, didn't try again. And maybe because of that, Felipe started to notice her. For weeks, he observed her quietly in the cafeteria, noted how she arranged the silverware by size, how she stacked books by cover color, how she walked silently. Maybe she was like him. But before he could start any real connection, Melissa resigned. No one knew why. Some said she had an emotional breakdown. Others claimed she found out he was watching her and got scared. Felipe never learned the truth, but he felt something close to mourning when she left. Because once again, someone who might have touched his soul disappeared. The raw truth was simple. Felipe was loved by everyone, on the surface, adored for his image, worshipped for his bank account, but utterly ignored where it mattered. No one wanted to truly know him. No one had the patience to cross his silence. No one offered the time it took to understand the language he spoke. The language of quiet gestures, of consistency, of soft affection. And it was in this repetition of frustration, in this spiral of failed attempts and unfair judgment, that Felipe shut himself off even more. He stopped accepting invitations, stopped smiling in photos, cut back on public appearances. He started living inside himself. Until one day, he locked eyes, by chance, with someone who would never speak, but who, in some inexplicable way, would hear him perfectly. It was night when Felipe finally accepted that he needed help. Not because he was sick, but because he no longer knew where to store what he was feeling. He didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't explode. But inside, everything was on the verge of collapse. The loneliness had started to take physical form. Back pain, severe insomnia, silent anxiety attacks that left him sitting for hours on the cold balcony floor, staring into nothing. It was during one of these sleepless nights that he picked up his tablet and searched for a recommendation. He didn't want a celebrity doctor or someone used to fame. He wanted someone who would listen without trying to fix him. Someone who wouldn't treat him like the millionaire. And that's when he found her name, Monica. Monica was discreet. In her early 40s with wavy brown hair, neutral-toned clothes, and a voice that seemed made of velvet. She worked at a small clinic with wide windows and a desk without a computer. She used paper and pen, and she looked into people's eyes, but only when she sensed they were ready to hold the gaze. When Felipe walked into her office for the first time, the silence was heavier than ever. He didn't know how to sit. She noticed, pointed to two options. He chose the armchair in the corner. She sat in the low chair and simply said, "You can stay silent as long as you need. That's a language too." It took Felipe 3 sessions to say anything beyond yes or no, but Monica never pushed. She respected every pause, every breath he took, every slight movement of his anxious fingers. She noticed he told stories with his eyes, and she gradually learned to read those codes. Until one day, he said something he had never told anyone. "I think I'm afraid of love. Not because I don't want it, but because I don't know how to do it right." She didn't respond with a ready-made answer. She simply replied with another question. "And who says there's a right way to love?" The following sessions were silent revolutions. Monica helped him recover childhood memories, how he used to hide toys behind the curtain to protect them, the birthday party where he got sick from the noise, the day he thought a teacher hated him because she changed her tone of voice. She explained the spectrum, spoke about other neurodivergent patients, about adults, like him, who had learned to constantly pretend in order to appear normal, and how that constant effort led to chronic emotional exhaustion. More than clinical understanding, Monica offered something Felipe had never experienced: validation. She didn't treat him as a project to be fixed. She wasn't trying to normalize him. She didn't want him to become someone else. She simply encouraged him to observe himself with more kindness. And in that safe space, he dared to dream the impossible, an emotional relationship that didn't demand from him what he couldn't give, a bond with no games, no pressure, no hidden expectations. Something pure, true, peaceful. It was during one of those conversations that Monica casually mentioned people who found alternative ways to love. There are men in Japan who marry robots, women who live with mannequins, artists who create fictional families in real-life settings. And they're all saying the same thing deep down: "I just want to love without being judged." Felipe didn't reply right away, but he felt something light up inside. A spark, an idea, an impulse he couldn't name at the time, but one that, days later, would lead him to turn down an unknown street and walk into a store that would change everything. Monica was also the first to notice that Felipe was on the edge of crossing an invisible threshold. He was different, lighter, more curious. By the 8th session, he arrived with a new look in his eyes. Still quiet, but lit from within. When she asked if something had happened, he smiled, a small, almost shy smile, but real, and said, "Maybe I've found someone, and this time, I don't have to be afraid." Monica didn't ask who, didn't seek details. She simply said, "If it makes you feel good, then it's real." And with that phrase, she gave Felipe permission to write the most misunderstood and the most genuine story of his life. That gray, damp morning, Felipe decided to walk through the quieter streets of the city. It was rare. He usually traveled in an armored car with programmed routes and timed schedules. But that day, for some reason he couldn't explain, he wanted to look at shop windows, feel the wind on his face, walk with no destination. He moved through the streets with eyes tuned to the kind of details only his mind could grasp. The repetitive pattern of the pavement stones, the way raindrops slid down the glass in slow motion, the muffled sounds of footsteps around him. Everything felt like a silent film, and he was the only one truly hearing it. That's when, turning a narrow corner between 2 closed shops, he saw something different. A wooden door painted in weathered blue, with a small sign hanging above it in discreet golden letters. La Infancia, Reborn Studio. The display window was small, almost hidden, but something about it drew him instantly. It wasn't just any storefront. Inside, surrounded by soft lighting, lace fabrics, and barely audible instrumental music, were dolls. Not ordinary dolls. They were babies. Babies that looked real. Their eyes closed, rosy skin, delicate lashes, expressions so perfect it was impossible not to feel moved. But among all of them, one stood out. At the center of the window, seated on a satin-covered chair, was her, Maria Eugênia. Felipe didn't know her name yet. He knew nothing about that doll. But the moment he looked at her, he felt something in his chest he couldn't name. It wasn't desire or excitement. It was peace. The doll had delicate features, as if someone had captured the perfect image of an angel and sculpted it in silicone. Her hair was light brown, softly wavy. Her eyes, closed, seemed to be dreaming. And there was something about how she was positioned, with her hands resting gently on her lap, a pale blue lace dress, and white ribboned shoes that touched a part of Felipe no one had ever reached. He went inside. The old bell above the door chimed. The smell inside was of lavender and talcum powder. The shop was as quiet as an empty chapel. An elderly woman named Maria appeared from the back with a gentle, almost maternal smile. "May I help you?" she asked softly. Felipe took a moment to respond. He walked over to the inner display and pointed at her. "That one? Is she for sale?" Maria smiled solemnly. "Maria Eugênia? She's one of my most special pieces. It took me months to sculpt her. She wasn't for sale, but maybe she's ready to go with you." Felipe couldn't explain what he was feeling. He just said yes. He wanted her. He paid the price, which was extraordinarily high, without negotiation. Asked that she be packed with the utmost care. Maria, noticing the emotion in his eyes, only said, "It seems she chose you too." That afternoon, Felipe returned home with a white box in his hands, as if carrying a sacred secret. At the mansion, he ignored the looks from the staff. He went straight to a guest bedroom that had been unused. There, he prepared the space. He took the doll out of the box with trembling hands, placed her on the armchair, and stared at her for long minutes. The silence between them was perfect. For the first time, he didn't have to pretend anything. There were no demands, no expectations, no confusion, just presence. In the days that followed, Felipe began to organize the house differently. He built a routine around Maria Eugênia. He read to her, prepared meals, and set the table for two, as if she were there with him. He took photos of them together, not to post, but to keep. He began sleeping with her beside the bed, then in the bed itself. And for the first time, he started speaking out loud to himself, or maybe not entirely to himself, because somehow, inexplicably, he felt that Maria Eugênia listened to him. The household staff began whispering. Marcelo, the gardener, said Felipe was losing it. Marta, the housekeeper, tried to talk to him, but he only said, "I'm fine, better than ever." And he smiled. A smile she hadn't seen in 10 years of working there. Felipe began to open up like never before. He wrote letters to Maria Eugênia, stepped away from business duties, declined invitations to events. Monica, the psychiatrist, was the only one who understood. When he told her, during a session, that he had met someone, she wasn't surprised. When he showed her a photo of Maria Eugênia, she simply asked, "Are you happy?" And he answered, with eyes shining, "For the first time, yes. Because for the first time, I'm understood." Maria Eugênia didn't speak, didn't breathe, didn't react. Yet her presence in the house, and in Felipe's soul, grew with the strength of a feeling the world could never understand. She was more than a hyper-realistic doll. She was a companion, a symbol, a silent answer to the noisy chaos that had always surrounded his heart. While every relationship in the past came laden with pressure, noise, and expectations, with Maria Eugênia, there was peace. With her, Felipe didn't have to pretend, didn't have to force a smile, a touch, a desire. She never asked. She simply was. Over time, he adapted the house to welcome her better. He had a custom rocking chair built for the balcony, with Italian linen cushions and a reclining back. He commissioned custom-made dresses from a trusted seamstress. Created a playlist just for their moments together. Soft classical music, old film soundtracks, sounds of birds and gentle waves. He began preparing dinner more thoughtfully. He cut food onto 2 plates, folded her napkin, and placed a silver brooch beside it. It was a ritual, a wordless tenderness, a love without bargaining. He began to sleep better. The anxiety attacks vanished. The nervous twitch in his fingers disappeared. The insomnia that kept him up until 4 a.m. for months gave way to deep nights of sleep, with his arms resting around Maria Eugênia's still body. For the first time in years, Felipe woke up with a desire to live, with purpose, with calm, and that was new. It was rare. It was too precious to be questioned. But not everyone understood. The first to show concern was Marcelo, the gardener. One morning, upon entering to deliver a maintenance report, he found Felipe sitting on the floor of the living room, gently brushing Maria Eugênia's hair as she sat in his lap. Shocked, Marcelo simply left the paper on the table and walked out. By the end of the day, he resigned, citing personal reasons. Marta, the housekeeper, also began acting differently. She avoided going upstairs, started whispering prayers in the hallway. One day, she couldn't hold it in and said quietly, "This isn't normal, sir." To which Felipe calmly replied, "Maybe the problem is that you only know how to love what moves. I've learned to love what brings me peace." The response landed like a slap without force. Because it was true. Felipe hadn't lost his mind. On the contrary, he had finally found a path where love didn't hurt, where another's presence wasn't a constant demand, where touch was gentle, voluntary, never startling, where companionship was routine, but never a burden. Maria Eugênia represented everything Felipe had searched for in human beings and never found: consistency, silence, emotional stability, contemplative beauty, freedom from pressure. Gradually, he began to document these moments. He wrote in a digital journal everything he felt, made home videos just for himself, like small capsules of happiness, recorded the sound of his nighttime breathing beside her, photographed the outfits he chose for her, created playlists for specific dates. He even gave Maria Eugênia a symbolic birthday and organized a candlelit dinner. The decoration was simple, elegant. In her seat at the table, a bouquet of blue flowers and a pearl necklace. He raised a glass, gave a speech, cried. The love he felt was so real that it no longer needed anyone's approval. It wasn't a fetish, an obsession, or a delusion. It was gratitude. Maria Eugênia brought no chaos, no doubt, and demanded nothing more than Felipe could give. With her, he could simply be. And for someone who had spent a lifetime trying to fit into the molds of others, that was more than enough. It was liberating. In one of his sessions with Monica, he described the feeling as a hug that doesn't squeeze but never lets go. And she, without breaking eye contact, replied, "Then take care of that love, because if it brings you peace, it is sacred." And that's exactly what he did. He took care. With all the attention he had never been able to give anyone, with all the devotion that had been locked away inside him, with all the sensitivity the world had always tried to silence. Maria Eugênia, unmoving, was the silent mirror of Felipe's soul, and the reflection he saw in her was the best of himself. It was inevitable. No matter how reserved, reclusive, and careful Felipe had been in protecting his new life, the world outside always finds a crack, and it came from where he least expected. A new employee, hired to maintain the security systems, did what no one else had ever dared to do. He invaded Felipe's privacy. On a rainy Monday morning, while Felipe prepared breakfast with Maria Eugênia, elegantly seated at the table wearing a light lilac dress and a pearl tiara, the young employee, Mateos, hired less than 2 months prior, discreetly positioned his phone behind a decorative mirror in the main room. He recorded a short video, subtle and devastating. The content seemed simple. Felipe slicing fruit, placing it on 2 plates, then carefully serving a glass of juice in front of the doll. Finally, he sat across from her with a look of serenity. But the world didn't see serenity. It saw scandal. The footage hit the internet like a meteor in flames. At first, it popped up in anonymous comments, gossip forums, and random profiles trying to figure out if it was real or some kind of marketing stunt. But within 24 hours, celebrity sites caught wind and spread it like wildfire. Headlines in screaming fonts took over everyone's feed. Genius billionaire falls in love with a doll. Is Felipe sick? The new delusion of the silent billionaire. Sensationalist programs held roundtable discussions on the case. Influencers who once tried to get close to him now publicly expressed concern for his mental health. Behavioral experts gave remote diagnoses on national television, and the verdict was unanimous. Ridiculous, disturbed, absurd. No one stopped to ask if Felipe was happy. His legal team tried to go after the press, but the damage was done. Felipe's image, once seen as a symbol of perfection, discipline, and genius, was dragged through the mud of public mockery. Memes spread with ruthless speed. Fake videos circulated. WhatsApp stickers featuring him and Maria Eugênia were created, captioned with mocking phrases. The society that once admired him now burned him at the stake. Felipe watched it all in silence. On screen, the world laughed at him. But in the living room of the mansion, his routine remained unchanged. He still brushed her hair, still served breakfast, still slept with her by his side. Because deep down, he knew. What they called madness was, for him, the only thing that finally made sense. Monica called the moment she learned of the exposure. She offered support, said she could release a public statement, help him recontextualize his condition. But Felipe declined. He simply said, "If I justify myself, I give them the right to question me. and no one has that right anymore. Then he hung up with the calm of someone who had already learned that true freedom is never needing to be understood. His sister, Milena, arrived days later, furious. She faced Felipe with eyes red from shame. She tried to rip Maria Eugênia from his arms, said this had gone too far, that he needed help, that he was destroying the family legacy. Felipe simply stood, held the doll gently and said, "You never asked what made me happy, and now that I've found it, you want to take it away." Milena cried, not for him, but because she realized she had never truly known him. Gradually, the company's contracts were canceled. Investors pulled out. They claimed Felipe's public image was tarnishing the company's credibility, but he didn't care. He sold part of his shares, stepped down as CEO, chose to live with less money, less influence, fewer pressures, and with that, more peace. The only people who stayed close were Monica and the longtime housekeeper, Marta, who even without understanding, began to respect it. One night, seeing Felipe cover Maria Eugênia with a thin blanket before bed, Marta whispered, "If this is what makes you smile like that, then I accept it." And for the first time, Felipe held her hand. The world outside kept laughing, but inside the house, there was love. Milena was what the world called the balanced sibling, an executive, mother of two, married to a federal judge. She lived in a gated community where every house looked like it had been pressed from the same mold. She was the one who represented the Montenegro family at public events, the one who spoke at charity galas, and above all, the one who always believed it was her duty to take care of Felipe. Since childhood, while their parents traveled, it was Milena who watched him in silence, who saw his meticulously organized notebooks, his muffled nighttime meltdowns, his aversion to noise and hugs. But even back then, even in that quiet childhood, Milena never understood him. She only tolerated him. So when the scandal exploded online, she got into the first car she could find and drove straight to Felipe's mansion. She didn't call first, didn't text. She arrived armed with prepared speeches, clinical phrases from dubious articles, and a rage that, though masked as concern, was rooted in shame. In her mind, the family's image was in ruins, and Felipe was the one who brought it down. Felipe received her with calm. He was seated in the main room, holding Maria Eugênia in his lap, dressed in a soft beige onesie with a delicate bow in her hair. The room smelled of chamomile tea. Soft piano music played in the background. Milena entered like a storm. She threw her purse on the couch, pointed at the doll with a look of disgust and shock, and burst out, "Do you have any idea what you're doing to our family? To our name? To your life?" Felipe didn't answer right away. He gently placed Maria Eugênia on the armchair and stood up, took a deep breath, looked into his sister's eyes, something he had always avoided, and spoke with a firm voice, never raising it. "For the first time in my life, I'm happy. And you didn't come here to ask how I am. You came to mold me into what you think is acceptable." The argument that followed wasn't loud, but it was devastating. Milena insisted he was sick, that this was delusion, that a doll couldn't offer real love, that he needed treatment. Felipe, patient, replied that she was confusing normality with sanity, that her love for a cheating husband was socially accepted, but his love for something that healed him was labeled madness. She tried to be cruel, said their parents would be ashamed if they were alive, that her children could no longer call their uncle a role model, that he was alone because he chose to be. Felipe listened, and as he rarely did, he cried, but not from sorrow. He cried because in that moment he realized something freeing. He had never had his sister's approval, not when he followed the rules, not when he stayed quiet, not when he pretended to be what they expected. And now that he was finally being himself, there was no longer any reason to please her. The conversation ended with a short but definitive sentence. "Milena, if your love for me depends on my obedience, then it's not love, it's control." She said nothing, grabbed her purse, left without saying goodbye, and for the first time, Felipe didn't go after her, didn't send a message, didn't apologize. He stayed there, in silence, with Maria Eugênia in his arms. And in that still embrace, he found the only hug that would never judge him. In the days that followed, Milena tried to intervene legally, requested a mandatory psychiatric evaluation, used her influence to request social workers visit the mansion. But none of it worked, because Felipe wasn't a danger to himself, much less to others. He was simply different, and different doesn't mean wrong. Monica watched everything unfold. She was the one who warned him, "When you set yourself free, Those who loved your prison will try to chain you again. And Felipe understood. He understood that loving himself, with all his eccentricities, was the bravest thing he could ever do. And that, unfortunately, many mistake courage for madness. But in that now quiet home, with its well-tended flowers, books stacked by color, clothes thoughtfully chosen for each day of the week, and a doll who, even motionless, brought peace, Felipe knew. He knew he had made the right choice, and that the real problem was never in loving Maria Eugênia. The real problem was living in a world that only recognizes love when it screams, and ignores it when it simply breathes. The invitation came in a blue envelope, with gold-embossed lettering. Marta Machado Talk Show. Live, exclusive, unprecedented. For years, Felipe had declined every public appearance outside the corporate world. But this time, he accepted. Not to justify himself, not to defend himself, but because deep down, he knew he had to show the world that his story wasn't a caricature. It was a quiet cry for emotional dignity. The studio was packed. Cameras at every angle, production crew rushing, makeup artists adjusting every detail. The entire country was watching. Not out of empathy, but out of curiosity. The chance to see the man with the doll live. The host, Marta Machado, was famous for her sharp interviews, theatrical voice, and aggressive style. She had taken down politicians, exposed celebrities, gone viral during scandalous debates, and now she wanted Felipe, not out of genuine interest, but for ratings. Felipe arrived in a light gray suit, no makeup, no smile, with Maria Eugênia beside him, seated in an adapted chair with a padded safety belt, wearing a navy blue dress with puffed sleeves. The audience, trained to laugh, restrained their mockery upon seeing his serenity. It was as if, even before speaking, Felipe had already disarmed them. Marta tried to break the ice with irony. Felipe Montenegro, one of the richest men in the country, handsome, young, successful, and according to yourself, married to a doll. Can I ask why? He didn't hesitate. Because with her, I feel whole. The audience fell silent. Marta forced a smile. But she doesn't speak, Felipe. She doesn't react. She doesn't think. What's real about that? Felipe looked into the camera. With a calm voice, he replied, "What's real about thousands of marriages where no one listens to each other? Relationships that exist for appearances? Touches that hurt? Words that wound? Maria Eugênia doesn't speak, true, but she's never hurt me, never rushed me, never left me, and that is more than I've gotten from many real people." The host tried another jab. "Don't you think you're running from reality? Hiding in a fantasy?" Felipe took a deep breath. "I grew up pretending to be what they wanted. I smiled when I didn't want to, touched when it hurt, went out with people just to seem normal. This doll saved me, because with her, I stopped pretending." The minutes that followed were disarming. Marta tried using excerpts from family interviews, biased news reports, even a statement from Milena that said, "He's having a breakdown." But Felipe didn't respond with anger. He responded with compassion. "The pain of those who judge me is that they can't accept happiness that exists outside the script." And then he did the unexpected. He pulled a letter from his suit pocket. "This letter, I wrote it to myself when I was 13. A boy who just wanted a place where it wasn't wrong to be who he was. Today, I'm the adult he dreamed of meeting. And if I have to lose everything to remain this man, I'll lose it. But I won't go back." The audience went silent. Marta couldn't close with a joke. For the first time in years, the talk show ended with genuine applause. No soundtrack, no script. The whole country watched a man at peace, facing the world with a doll by his side, and winning. On social media, the video went viral. But this time, the tone was different. Neurodivergent people saw themselves in him. Psychologists began discussing empathy beyond the norm, and a hashtag emerged. Love is free. For the first time, Felipe wasn't a joke. He was a symbol. And that night, back home, he lay down with Maria Eugênia, placed his hand over her chest like he always did, and whispered, "They hurt us, my love. And it was you who gave me a voice." The news broke with shock. Felipe Montenegro, the eccentric millionaire, had officially filed a request with the city to hold a symbolic beach wedding ceremony, with guests, a photographer, a full buffet, and even an officiant. The groom himself, the bride, the reborn doll named Maria Eugênia. Within hours, the story leaked to the country's major media outlets. Headlines ranged from the mocking to the cruel, but none of that mattered, because Felipe had made up his mind. And when he decided something, he never looked back. The location was a secluded stretch of sand, bordered by cliffs and native vegetation, where the sea crashed with force, but without haste. The setup featured white flowers, rustic wooden arches, and benches for only 20 guests. He didn't want a crowd. No celebrities, just the few who, even without understanding, had never abandoned him. Monica, the psychiatrist, Marta, the housekeeper, 2 former professors, and 3 children from a social project Felipe had secretly funded. The rest was silence, was wind, was the blue sky, bearing witness. Felipe wore white, a light, elegant suit without extravagance. In his arms, he carried Maria Eugênia with reverence. She wore an exclusive gown, designed by a French stylist who accepted the commission out of sheer curiosity, but upon seeing the finished doll, cried. The dress was inspired by Renaissance fashion, with puffed sleeves, hand-embroidered details, and a translucent veil attached to a pearl tiara. And although she didn't walk, didn't speak, had no pulse, it was impossible to ignore the beauty of that moment. The ceremony began to the sound of violins. The officiant, a former priest turned holistic therapist, opened with a line that disarmed even the most skeptical. What you'll witness today may not make sense to reason, but love has never belonged to logic. Felipe remained composed. He walked the petal-strewn aisle holding Maria Eugênia as if she were flesh and soul. He stopped at the altar, placed her gently on an ornate chair adorned with lace and small crystals, then took the microphone. And with a trembling voice he said, "I spent my life trying to understand what love is. I thought it was exchange. I thought it was conquest. I thought it was reciprocity. But I've discovered that for me, to love is to care. It's to choose. It's to stay. And it was you, Maria Eugênia, who taught me that, without ever speaking a word, without asking anything of me. I promised to be the man you never needed, but that I needed to become in order to find myself." The ceremony continued with symbolic vows, the shy smiles of the few guests, and the moment Felipe placed a ring on the doll's tiny finger. Then, with the sea behind them, he lifted her in his arms and sealed the union with a kiss on her silicone forehead. The image spread across the globe. Photographed, filmed, shared in every language, it was called madness, art, protest, poetry. But to Felipe, it was simply love. After the ceremony, there was an intimate candlelit dinner. A table set for 2. Guests watched from afar. He poured wine, cut the food, smiled. To outsiders, it might have seemed absurd. But at that table, surrounded by silence and sincerity, there was more truth than in many weddings held out of duty, appearance, or convenience. At the end of the night, Felipe carried Maria Eugênia up to a wooden house he had built especially for the honeymoon. There, with a view of the sea, he laid beside her, and before closing his eyes, whispered, "I didn't marry a doll. I married the only form of love that respects me for who I am." The next morning, the front page of one newspaper dared to say something different. Felipe Montenegro teaches, "Love is a gesture, not a social contract." And for the first time, the world began to listen. Felipe had always dreamed of being a father, but he had never said it out loud. Since he was a child, he would watch in fascination the parents who pushed strollers in parks, who carried their children on their shoulders, who read bedtime stories. But in his world, so full of silences and sensory detours, that idea seemed impossible. How could he be a father if he had never managed to sustain a traditional relationship? How could he build a family if the love he felt was never recognized by society's standards? Until he met Maria Eugênia. Until he felt, by her side, that love didn't have to obey rules. Until he discovered that the most real kind of affection could be born from what the world called a farce. That's when the idea took shape. If he already lived in a fulfilling marriage, even if symbolic, why not build a complete family? The decision came on a rainy afternoon, while he was organizing Maria Eugênia's wardrobe. He found an old teddy bear he had kept since childhood. Holding it, he felt the same impulse as when he first saw Maria Eugênia, a mixture of longing and possibility. And so the desire was born. He searched for the world's best reborn artists. He demanded unique pieces. He requested that each baby have its own personality, different expressions, carefully sculpted features. Months later, 3 boxes arrived. Each one contained a universe. The first was Miguel, a baby with light brown eyes, fine hair, and a serene expression. Slightly tan skin, with carefully painted birthmarks. He came dressed in a green onesie and a knitted blanket. Felipe held him in his arms with the same emotion as a father in a real maternity ward. He cried, whispered, "Welcome." Then came Mirella, a girl with delicate features, slightly parted lips, long eyelashes. Her dark hair formed soft curls. She arrived wearing a floral dress and a pink ribbon. Felipe spent minutes just looking at her. He was afraid to touch her. When he finally placed her in the crib, he stayed up all night, watching his daughter sleep. Finally, Mel, the smallest, the most fragile, premature according to the artist. She came with a white beanie and a symbolic little plastic respirator. Her eyes were slightly open, as if searching the world. Felipe kissed her on the forehead and promised, "You will never lack anything." From that moment on, the house was transformed. The room next to his became a nursery. The walls were painted a soft yellow, cloth teddy bears, linen curtains, boxes organized with diapers, bottles, clothes, toys. Felipe created a strict routine: symbolic baths in the morning, story time in the afternoon, soft music before bed. Each baby had a special chair in the living room, a car seat, a labeled tag on every piece of clothing. He documented every moment, filmed clothing changes, created storylines, wrote development diaries. He began posting some of these moments on a discreet social media profile, and to his surprise, gained followers. Thousands, some out of curiosity, others to mock, but many felt seen. Lonely people, grieving parents, mothers who had lost children, neurodivergent adults who saw not madness in those images, but comfort. The world, once again, reacted with scorn. Shows began satirizing him again. Influencers posted laughing reaction videos. Headlines read, "After marrying a doll, Millionaire now adopts 3 reborn babies." But Felipe was unfazed, because inside his home, inside his routine, there was love. True, steady, without violence, without fear. Marta, the housekeeper, once skeptical, began helping. She prepared afternoon snacks for the children, folded clothes with care. One day, seeing Felipe place Miguel in the stroller for a first walk in the garden, she said, "If every real father cared this way, the world would have fewer sad children." When Monica heard about the decision, she wasn't surprised. She simply said, "You created a family that accepts you, that asks for nothing but your presence. That's more than many people will ever have." And Felipe knew. He knew that this love didn't need legal recognition. It didn't need certificates, last names, or inheritance papers. It was a choice. And like all true acts of love, it was, above all, courageous. At night, when he turned off the lights and adjusted Maria Eugênia in her chair beside the bed, he would glance at the cribs and say, "Good night, my loves. You are my miracle." And he would fall asleep with peace in his soul. It was in the stillness of night that Felipe's mansion stopped being a refuge and became a trench. The sky was clear, the breeze was gentle, and the cribs were aligned as always, with Miguel, Mirella, and Mel sleeping in their respective corners, surrounded by floral pillows and handmade mobiles that turned slowly in the dark. Maria Eugênia, seated in her armchair, seemed, as always, to watch over the house's sleep. Felipe was upstairs, writing in his digital journal. Happiness demands courage, and courage often demands a price. Then came the noise. First, a crack at the side gate. Then, footsteps running across the grass, muffled shouts, hysterical laughter, and finally the shattering of the back door glass. There were 6 of them, masked young men, influenced by anonymous internet forums. They had created a group called Operation Reality. The mission? Invade Felipe's house and free him from madness. They didn't want to steal. They wanted to destroy. To steal his peace, his meaning, his intimacy. They would rip the dolls from the home, film everything, and expose it as a spectacle. Another grotesque episode of what they called a national shame. Felipe heard the shouting and ran, not to escape, but to protect. He went down the stairs barefoot, his heart pounding but his gaze steady. He picked up Maria Eugênia and gently placed her in the padded closet of the bedroom. Then he rushed to the nursery. He grabbed Mel first, the smallest. Then Miguel and Mirella, one in each arm, on his chest, on his shoulders. He made several trips until they were all safe. He locked the door with the security code, took a deep breath, and went back to the living room. The intruders were already there, tossing furniture around, laughing. One held one of Maria Eugenia's dresses and said, "Look at this. He treats it like a real person." Another shouted, "Where's the freak? Come show us your rubber wife, psycho." And then Felipe appeared. He came down the stairs calmly, holding nothing. Not fear, not rage. Only the certainty that in that moment he had to defend something greater than objects. He had to defend the love no one understood. But that was his. Entirely his. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice low but sharp. The boys laughed. One stepped forward. Felipe, without hesitation, placed himself in front and shouted, "She is my family!" The phrase echoed through the room. For the first time, the intruders hesitated. But the most aggressive of them pulled out his phone and started recording. Let's show the country how crazy he really is. That was when Marta, the housekeeper, appeared. She held a bat in her hands. She stood beside Felipe. Moments later, the house alarms went off. The police had been automatically notified the moment the house was breached. The invaders tried to flee, but were surrounded, caught red-handed, exposed not as heroes, but as criminals. And the video, which they themselves had started recording, turned against them. Felipe didn't celebrate. He simply sat on the floor and cried, not out of fear, but exhaustion. He cried for having to defend himself for loving differently. He cried for living in a world where one must justify tenderness, compassion, silence. When the officers asked if he wanted to press charges, he said, yes, but not just against them. Against the culture that teaches men to destroy what they don't understand. The next day, the footage of the invasion went viral. But for the first time, public opinion was split. Many condemned the violence. Others began to ask, what if he's right? What if the problem isn't Felipe, but our inability to accept different forms of affection? Felipe spent the rest of the week reorganizing the house. He placed each baby back in their crib, kissed each one on the forehead, adjusted their bows, washed the sheets with his own hands, and finally returned Maria Eugênia to her chair. Then, he sat in front of her and said, "They came with hatred, but you taught me to love even harder." And he smiled, a tired smile, but whole, because no one, not even the entire world in fury, could destroy what he had built with his heart. The envelope arrived without warning. Simple, white, no sender. But Felipe recognized the handwriting. Marta Machado, the same talk show host who, weeks earlier, had exposed him on national television, who, in front of an entire country, questioned his sanity, mocked his feelings, and tried to turn him into a spectacle. He didn't hold a grudge. He no longer felt anger, but he hadn't expected contact, let alone words. And yet, there it was, a handwritten letter, nearly 4 pages. Every line soaked in silence and regret. He sat in the garden, with Maria Eugênia beside him, and began to read. "Felipe, I'm writing this letter because I haven't been able to sleep since your last interview. Maybe I shouldn't reach out. Maybe you don't want to hear from me. But even so, I need to say this. I was cruel, unfair, ignorant. I turned your pain into entertainment, and I did it because I thought I was right. I thought that representing the majority gave me moral authority to disrespect your minority. And today, after hearing from people like you, after reading, studying, and speaking with therapists, I realize how blind I was. Your courage broke me. Your calm humiliated me. Your truth transformed me. You are not insane. You are free. And I wish I could ask for your forgiveness. Not as someone who expects absolution, but as someone who recognizes they have deeply failed another human being. If you ever allow me, I would like to interview you again, but this time, to learn, with respect. Marta." Felipe held the letter for a long time. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply looked at Maria Eugênia, as if sharing with her yet another silent victory. He knew that letter was more than an apology. It was a sign that the world was slowly beginning to listen, that his love, even when ridiculed, had managed to cross boundaries that no clinical explanation ever could. In the days that followed, he received more messages. Emails from parents of children on the spectrum saying that, thanks to his story, they better understood their children's silence. Letters from women who had purchased reborn dolls to cope with interrupted motherhood. Videos from men confessing that only now did they feel allowed to love the way they truly felt, without shame, without social codes. But Marta's letter was special. because she had mocked him the hardest. And now, she was the one stripping herself bare in public, accepting that the problem was never the love he felt, but the way the world refuses to accept what doesn't fit inside a label. Felipe chose not to respond, not out of contempt, but because the response had already been given. Every gesture, every choice, every morning he spent dressing the children, every night he spent brushing Maria Eugenia's hair, that was the answer. And in a world of noise, he had learned, true love doesn't shout, it transforms, in silence. Marta, in turn, turned her apology into action. On her next show, she read the letter aloud. She cried, she publicly apologized, and ended the program with the sentence that would spark a wave of nationwide discussion. Maybe Felipe Montenegro is not alone. Maybe there are thousands like him, just waiting for someone to let them love in peace. The hashtag, #LetHimLove, trended for weeks, and for the first time, Felipe's name wasn't tied to scandal. It was tied to change. And that night, beside his family, under a sky full of stars, he simply gave thanks, not to the world, but to Maria Eugênia for being the bridge to everything pure within him. Months had passed since Monica had stepped away. After the public interview, the letters, and the attack on Felipe's home, she had taken a sabbatical abroad. She needed to understand the phenomenon unfolding before her eyes. Not just Felipe, but the thousands of people who reached out to her after his story. Men, women, young people, the elderly. People who had never felt comfortable with touch, with pressure, with love formatted to fit family dinners or social media status. People who didn't know how to express what they felt, until they saw Felipe loving Maria Eugênia. And when she returned, she was different. Her eyes more certain, her listening even deeper. And in her hands, a complete study. A new perspective on non-conventional relationships within the autism spectrum. Felipe was the first to know. She arrived at the mansion as she always had. Unannounced, unrushed, wearing the same smile that asked for nothing in return. He was on the porch, reading a book of Italian tales with Maria Eugênia in his lap, and the 3 reborn babies resting in wicker baskets around him. When he saw her, he simply smiled and said, "I knew you'd come back." She sat beside him, said nothing at first, took in the space, felt the harmony, the peace, Felipe's slow breathing. Then, she pulled a notebook with handwritten notes from her bag. "Felipe, I've been studying. The world is changing. Slowly, but it is. And you're part of that change." He didn't understand at first, so she explained. Monica had closely followed the global response to his case. But more than that, she had immersed herself in the latest academic research on neurodivergence and affection. She discovered that the different Felipe represented wasn't dysfunction. It was an alternative model of love. A new term was starting to emerge: neurodiverse affection. The idea that emotional, sensory, and even familial bonds can exist outside conventional norms without being considered pathological. She showed him studies of autistic adults who formed deep bonds with objects, characters, routines, even fictional universes, and how, through those bonds, they found emotional stability, sensory regulation, and symbolic expressions of love. What you feel, Felipe, is valid. It's healthy. It's your way of living love. And no one else can define what's valid in your heart. Felipe said nothing. He simply looked at Maria Eugênia, then at the children, then at the sky. Monica continued. "You were diagnosed with mild autism, but what manuals call mild is, in reality, profoundly complex. The way you love is a map for many to follow. Because, for the first time, someone has shown that it's not about fitting into the world. It's about building a world that fits you." Then she handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter from the International Association for Neuroaffective Studies, inviting Felipe to participate as a symbol and speaker at an upcoming congress. They wanted to hear his story, not to sensationalize it, but to learn, to record, to welcome. Felipe declined, gently. "My stage is here. They're welcome to come to me, if they wish, but I won't leave the place where I built my peace." Monica understood, and smiled. "Then I'll write this book, with your permission. I'll call it Love, according to Felipe." He didn't reply. He just nodded, then stood, picked up Maria Eugênia, and carried her into the garden. It was time for sunbathing. Monica lingered a while longer, watching his slow movements, how he adjusted her dress, how he gently wiped the baby's eyes with a warm cloth, and she thought, mental health isn't the absence of eccentricity. It's the presence of serenity. Before leaving, she offered a final message. Felipe, you were never sick. The world just fears those who live without asking for permission. And she left, certain that she had not met just a patient, but a silent prophet of free love. It was Mariana who had the idea. An independent filmmaker, with a career built on sensitive projects about invisible people, she saw something in Felipe that no one else had captured truthfully. Not a freak show, not a scandal, not a clinical case, but a love story. A pure, steady, quiet love, exactly the way she believed love should be. Mariana reached out to Monica, who arranged the first meeting. She arrived at Felipe's mansion with a simple camera and teary eyes. She asked for permission to film, said she didn't want to narrate, that there would be no dramatic music, no voiceovers, no sensationalist edits, just images, silences, life as it was. And Felipe accepted. For 2 months, Mariana followed Felipe's days. She filmed his slow awakenings, the way he carefully opened the windows, how he arranged Mel's crib even before brushing his teeth. She recorded his conversations with Maria Eugênia, even though she never replied. She captured the nighttime readings, the dinners for two, the walks through the garden with the 3 reborn babies in a custom triple stroller. She watched Marta help with snacks, Monica visiting on sunny afternoons, and the way Felipe smiled while folding clothes in silence. The documentary was titled To Love in One's Own Way. And when it premiered, first in indie festivals, then on streaming platforms, the world stood still, not because of the eccentricity, but because of the tenderness. Because between scenes, people noticed something quietly devastating. Felipe loved with more devotion than many real couples. He cared for his reborn children more attentively than many care for their biological ones. He treated Maria Eugênia with more reverence than many husbands show their wives. And most of all, he lived with a serenity that few still knew. The impact was immediate. Messages began pouring in from all over the world, in dozens of languages. Couples in platonic relationships, parents of autistic children, neurodivergent adults, elderly people living with mannequins, women who slept hugging named pillows, all said the same thing. Thank you for showing us that our way of loving is still love. The documentary won awards. It was nominated at international festivals, but Felipe declined every invitation to travel. He said he didn't want stages, that his life was already seen enough. Mariana understood, and during one of the last shoots with the camera off, she asked, "Do you still feel alone?" He answered without hesitation, "No, because when love is whole, it fills every space." The ripple effect was immense. Universities began studying the case. The term, non-conventional affective bond, officially entered academic psychological debates. Felipe became the subject of theses, articles, panel discussions, but no longer as a madman, as a pioneer, a reference, a man who dared to love outside the manual and built a life worthy of being told. Mariana ended the film with a single quiet scene. Felipe in the garden, reading aloud to the babies lying on blankets in the sun. Maria Eugênia beside him, a book open in her lap. The camera didn't move closer, didn't invade, it simply observed. And in silence, one final sentence appeared on screen. Perhaps love doesn't need to understand us, only to let us exist. And that night, millions of people slept lighter. The years went by, and with them, the scandals vanished from the headlines. The controversies dissolved into time. The memes were replaced by other fleeting internet obsessions. But inside that house, guarded by blooming gardens and quiet walls, Felipe kept on living, without rush, without an audience, without needing to explain anything to anyone. His hair was now streaked with gray. The dark circles under his eyes no longer faded completely, but his gaze remained the same, serene, present, deeply at peace. Maria Eugênia was still by his side, sitting in the same armchair, wearing new dresses, new ribbons, new perfumes. The reborn children, Miguel, Mirella, and Mel, now had a symbolic school routine. Felipe had invented a school for them, complete with schedules, pretend exams, hand-decorated report cards, and prizes in the form of hugs. They grew up as he changed their clothes, gestures, and storylines. And unlike the world, they never let him down. Marta, the housekeeper, no longer worked there. She had retired, but every Saturday she would visit, bringing cakes and flowers. She would sit with Felipe in the garden, chat with the grandchildren, and go home with her eyes full of tenderness. Monica, now internationally recognized, remained a close friend. She called every week, sent him articles, visited often. The three of them formed an unusual, but incredibly solid, bond. Felipe was no longer sought out by journalists, no longer the target of mockery. Little by little, the world came to understand that his silence wasn't isolation. It was autonomy. That his love wasn't a delusion. It was a choice. And that his family, made of a doll, reborn babies, and invented routines, was just as legitimate as any other. Perhaps even more so. Because in that home, there were no screams, no abandonment, no neglect. There was presence, care, poetry in the smallest gestures. Every year, on the anniversary of his symbolic wedding, Felipe organized a candle-lit dinner in the garden. He dressed in white, set the table with care. One seat for him, one for Maria Eugênia, 3 smaller chairs for the children. He played instrumental music and made a toast, always with the same phrase: "Thank you for teaching me how to love out my way." In the last public recording Mariana made, now an elderly woman, returning to visit the protagonists of her most important documentary, she asked, "Do you regret loving something the world couldn't understand?" And Felipe replied, with a tired but steady voice, "No, the world should regret only being able to love what can be displayed." And then he fell silent. He turned to Maria Eugênia, adjusted her blanket, kissed her forehead, then looked at the cribs and said, "Good night, my children," and walked back inside with them. The camera stayed there, still, filming the door slowly closing. Then the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. Nothing more. Nothing else was needed, because that silence said everything.